Hi everyone, my name is Hussein and in this video we are going to talk about external configuration store pattern. This pattern comes under design and implementation and operational excellence categories of cloud design patterns. And it's about moving the configuration information out from the application deployment package. We are all aware that in Azure Functions app or Azure App Service, there is a local configuration settings that you can use to define different configuration items for your application. And what we are going to do in this pattern is to try to pull out this information from the local configuration settings from the Functions app or app service to store them somewhere else. And there are a lot of benefits of doing this, and we are going to see them in more details in this video. Now let's dive into the example to help us understand this pattern better. Let's assume that our application deployment package is in Azure App Service, or Functions app, or even it could be an application deployed on a VM on Azure. Each of these components will have its own configuration settings, which is going to be a config file in the case of VM, and it's going to be the app configuration settings in case of the Functions app and app service. There is already a built-in feature in Azure Portal that allows you to define different app settings configuration for your Functions app or app service. And so far, so good, until we decide that we want to deploy multiple instances of the app service that we have. So all of these instances of the same application. And similarly for the Functions app, we might need to deploy different Functions app for different applications that still want to share some configuration information that's been already set up in one of the Functions app. And similarly for the VMs as well. And all of us know that the local configuration of the Functions app or an app service is very local to the running component. Like we cannot share certain configuration settings across multiple app services even if they are multiple instances of the same application. And this is one challenge. Also from the other side, if we have a totally different Functions app that still need to share some common configuration items, maybe like a database connection string or log analytics workspace that's going to send its logs to it. It's not possible at the moment to share a certain configuration item from one Functions app to be used across multiple Functions apps. So we are going to end up having multiple configuration items for each of these components in our architecture, which is going to make the life harder for us if we decided to change a certain configuration item in our system. So in this case, we will have to go through all of the config files or all of the config settings for all of these components to make sure that our changes has been changed correctly. Also, every time we change our configuration settings, we need to restart our Azure Functions app or app service in order for our changes to take place, which might cause a little bit of a downtime to our services, which might not be a good idea if you have a really high SLA that you need to maintain with your clients. So the challenges that we have now is that the local configuration in one Azure app service cannot share its settings across multiple app services of the same application. They might be multiple instances of the same application, and they might be different applications altogether, but still need to share or read the same configuration information. And more importantly, that we will need to restart our component every time we change the configuration settings. So these are the challenges that we have. Now let's see how can we use the external configuration store pattern to resolve these problems. Now let's clean this up. And what we are going to do in here is we are going to introduce a cloud-based storage. And we are going to move the local configuration settings from the app service and Functions app and from the VM and put them in the cloud-based storage. And the cloud-based storage could be a Key Vault or a blob storage or even a SQL database or any other cloud-based storage that you would like. But the idea is to moving the configuration settings out from the different components and put them in a highly available cloud-based storage, so all of the components can access it easily and directly. And by doing this, we have escaped away from having multiple configuration settings for each Azure component that we might have. Because in complex architectures, you might have hundreds or even thousands of Azure Functions app, and it's going to be a nightmare if you wanted to change a certain configuration settings across all of these Functions app at once. In addition to the need to restart the Functions app after you change the configuration settings. Also, it's very common to cache the configuration settings in a local cache to make the retriever even faster for different components that are trying to retrieve these configuration settings. It's going to be way more efficient and way more faster for these components to grab this data from a local cache. And you need to be aware of the cache expiration policy that you are going to define for your local cache. So in case you made some changes in the configuration settings in the cloud-based storage, it's going to take some time to be available in the local cache. Also, as an alternative, you can have a local cache for each of these Azure components, so you can cache the configuration settings that you are going to read from the cloud-based storage. But in this case, you are going to have a less control over the cache expiration policy and how often the cache is going to get refreshed from the source. And we have talked about the caching pattern in a previous video, so I'm going to put a link for this if you are interested to review it. Now let's have a look at this diagram that I've got from Microsoft documentation that explains it really well. So we are going to have a different sort of applications that reads from an external configuration store, which is going to be a cloud storage, SQL database, Key Vault, blob storage, any cloud storage you would like to use. And it's going to be even better if you are going to cache this configuration into a local store for faster retrieval. This is what the external configuration store pattern is about. Pulling out different application settings or configuration settings from the local application settings and store it externally to be shared across multiple applications. Now let's talk about some considerations you need to be aware of when you use this pattern. And the first thing you need to be aware of is the performance and availability of the cloud-based storage that you are going to use. We have already pulled out the application settings from the local configuration settings from different components and put them in this cloud-based storage. And you need to make sure it's highly available and can take many requests from different applications. And for any reason this cloud-based storage wasn't available, it might affect the availability of your applications if you are not using any cache. Also, you need to make sure that the cloud-based storage that you are going to use is flexible enough to support different schemas. We all know that most of the app config settings are key value pair, but some settings might require you to have a complex data types or even a collection of data. In this case, you want to make sure that your cloud-based storage is flexible enough to support the different schemas that you might use in your application. Also, you need to be aware of that using an external configuration store won't solve all your problem at once, because you might use an XML config file that sits in a blob storage, and every time you want to get a certain configuration value, you need to parse the XML file in order to get the certain value. So yes, you might be using an external configuration store, but somehow you have added a lot of complexity to it, which is going to have a negative impact on the performance of the application or on the retriever of these configuration settings. And you need to be aware of that. Also, you need to think of how are you going to control the scope of the configuration settings. So in some cases, you might have some configuration settings that you want to apply at the organization level, and some settings you want to apply at the application level, and some settings you want to apply at the local machine level. Also, it might need to prevent or allow certain applications from override the higher level settings. For example, you might define a certain configuration settings at the organization level, and you don't want any application to be able to override these settings. So you need to think of this as well. Also, you want to make sure that your external configuration store can deliver the data in the required format, whether it's a key value pair or typed data or collection of data. You want to avoid doing any transformation of the data while you are retrieving it from the external configuration store. Also, you need to consider how your configuration store will behave if settings contain errors, or they don't even exist at all. It might be a good idea to return the default settings and log this error to give you a chance to troubleshoot this later on. Also, you need to consider how are you going to handle the case sensitivity, upper and lower case for the key names. Also, how are you going to handle binary data? And how are you going to handle the null and empty values in your configuration store as well? Also, you need to consider how are you going to allow the access to the configuration store to just allow the valid users or application to be able to access your external configuration store. Also, you want to make sure that you have a clear separation between the roles required by different applications. Some applications might require to have a read-only access to the configuration store, and other applications might require to have a write access. So you might need to have a really clear separation on what permissions are required by different applications. And also, it's going to be a good idea if you are going to store a sensitive information in your configuration store to encrypt this data. If it's a database username and password, it's definitely a good idea to encrypt this data in the external configuration store. And for the centrally stored configuration, we need to deal with it very carefully, and we have a more extensive testing for these kind of configurations. Because you might have one common configuration settings that's been used across multiple applications. And if you are going to change this setting, you want to make sure that all of these applications are going to behave well after you change this configuration. So part of your testing plan, you need to test all of the applications that might be using this certain configuration item that has been changed. This is to make sure that it won't affect any of the running applications. And as we said before, if you are going to cache your configuration settings, you want to make sure that you define a caching expiration policy, which is going to define how often you want your application to invalidate the data from the cache and grab a fresh information from the cloud-based storage. Now let's see when you should use this pattern. If you have a common configuration settings that are shared across multiple instances of the same application, or even shared across multiple different applications. Also, when you have a complex data types that are not supported by the standard configuration systems, like an image for example, or a complex data type, these kind of things are not supported by default in the standard configuration system. And if this is the case, the external configuration store pattern will be perfect for you. Also, if you want to define a default settings for all applications that are running in your organization, at the same time, you want to allow certain applications to override certain configuration settings that you have already defined at the organization level. And finally, and most importantly, it's going to make the administration task much easier. Imagine what would be the case if you want to update a certain configuration settings for hundreds or thousands of Azure Functions app. It's going to be way easier for you to change them once in an external configuration store than to go through all of the Functions app to try to change your settings one by one. Now we are coming to the end of this video. I hope now it's clear for you what the external configuration store pattern is about. How can we implement it? What are the different challenges we are trying to solve? And what are the different considerations we need to be aware of when we implement this pattern? I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any question, please put it in the comments below. And thanks for watching.